Okay, we're going to go over multi-displacement maps in Maya. Here we have a scene with a polygonal column. Over here is just an area light with some ray trace shadows. And here is a point light. First off, I want to show an example with a render really quick of diffuse, spec, and bump map on a basic cylinder. The only problem with this is that you are given away around the silhouette. Now I want to have these little vents come out. So we're going to mess with displacement maps, and they're not very expensive at all. What I have in the scene here in my outliner is 3 different pieces of displacement, 3 different meshes. First I got a column, and then I took that column, duplicated it, and smoothed out the edges. And then the third one I did was a combined piece of geometry for those actual vents and extra little parts here and there. So 3 total meshes right on top of each other. And we're going to go ahead and bake out some displacement maps. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Lighting, Transfer Maps. And we already created a displacement map, and we're going to call that Bake1 JPEG. We got to make our target and our source. So I'm just going to grab a column, and that's going to be our target. And then our first displacement map is the smoothed edges, and we'll say source. And coming down, again, JPEG, and then we're going to save these as 1300 by 1300. And go ahead and bake. Alrighty, baked our first one out, which we baked to a folder. Now we're going to go ahead and batch out the other one. So I'm going to take my source and remove it, and add my new source as the combined pieces of geometry. So again, this is just a duplicated mesh of our original with added pieces and combined. So I'm going to go ahead and take this and say add source. And what we want to do is, with both of these on, I want to switch over to envelope. And I want to make sure that my envelope gets pushed out enough so that I at least get clear of these little cylinders and so forth. So I want to be able to make sure they're included. So maybe a 4.7 looks good. And then we can just go back to mesh. Now let's go ahead and bake that one out, but before we do that, we got to just change the bake to 2 and say bake. Alrighty, now that we've baked out 2 displacement maps, let's head over into Photoshop. Here is the 1300 by 1300 Photoshop file with a diffuse, a spec, and a bump map. What I want to do now is to bring in my displacement maps. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up those files that were baked. So there's Bake1 and Bake2. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab these and put them into, with a copy and a paste. And get rid of that one. And copy and paste. And we'll go ahead and name these for Displace 1 and Displace 2. So these were the 2 baked ones. And then I added a third one, which was hand-drawn through just blurring out and using my marquee tools here, circles and rectangle, and just drawing on here, and using the original diffuse map open under layers and so forth. So I have this separate layer here, and what's cool about when you blur white squares, it gives that nice fall off, so it gives a more organic feel to your geometry. Instead of having all the tessellation that you would need to have a nice round edge, you can have that in your displacement map. So these are just black and white dots and so forth. Now the problem with that is we need to work it from a 50% gray, so I'll go ahead and add a layer and call that 50% gray. And I'll go ahead and fill that with 50% gray. So there you go. So there's our first displacement map. Second, in fact, I'm going to rename these and call that 2 and call that 1. Okay. And we're going to go ahead and save these out separately as JPEGs. And now that we have them as JPEGs, we're going to go ahead and back in our Maya scene here, and we're going to open up our Hypershade and just graph out our network. And we're going to create a displacement network. So under displacement, and create a displacement map node. And we're going to go ahead and create a file node. Grab that. And a multiplier node. Alrighty. And I'm going to go ahead and middle mouse drag the file into the multiplier node and say other, and say out alpha input 1x. I go into my network here under the actual texture node, and under color balance, because we have to adjust for grayscale, we'll turn on alpha's luminance and put -0.5 in the alpha offset. And we'll grab the multiplier node and we'll say duplicate shader network. So we get one more of those. And we'll do it again. Edit, duplicate shader network, like so. And last but not least, we're going to have an added node. Average added, and this will add by default, set to sum. Just middle mouse drag onto the plus sign, input 3D 0, you'll get a green line. Again, just middle mouse drag this one on, hit input 3D 1, and finally input 3D 2. So you get 3 of these adding up, and we'll go ahead and middle mouse drag that onto and hit the other. So from the plus average added node to the displacement node, and we'll say output 3dx to displacement. And we can tell when we look at the displacement node, it says a total displacement of 3. 1, 2, 3. And last but not least, we can just middle mouse drag this onto the blend displacement map, and that'll connect to the actual shader group node. So there we go. One last thing to do, take your multiplier nodes and bring the second input 2's to 0. This is going to turn them off. A multiplier node takes this number times this number. So if you want 1 times 2 equals 2, you get twice the effect. So if you want to overcrank your displacements, you can do that. So these two are set to 0. This one over here is set to 1. And let's start plugging in these displacement maps. So let's go ahead and hit File, and go into C, Displacement, go to Textures, and then we'll jump onto column underscore displacement 1. Here's the 3 that we exported out. And this is just for those nice smooth edges. So let's go ahead and see how that works. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and first go to input 0 to turn it off and just get a basic render. And I'm looking at the silhouette here to kind of feel this out. So nothing along the edges here. We can see that through our alpha. And we'll just go ahead and turn on that displacement map. So I'll set that to 1. And if I want, I can just do a render region. And if we take a look, there's a difference there. This area was painted a little bit in, so it's kind of pushing in. So we got smooth edges, and we're pushing in. Now we can overcrank that by setting this to maybe a value of 3. So let's go ahead and render that out. And that looks good. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. Okay, so the first one's in. Now let's move on to the second one. And this will be the vents, and that's displacement 2. And let's go ahead and start that number up at, say, 2. So input 2. So I'll go ahead and save that, render this out. All right, looking good. Again, if we want to, we could overcrank this to something, say 3. And this stuff works really well. It gives itself away when you get really close, but far enough distances, it really gives an extra added effect. So we can see there's silhouette going on, and I think 3 is what we're going to stick with. And now let's go for the last one, which is going to be the one we hand-drawn. And this one is going to be it's high contrast compared to these two, so we're going to be very careful with this one. So let's go ahead and set this to 1. So let's go ahead and see how that looks. Okay, we're getting a little bit of overshoot here from these are actually little pieces that if we kind of look in the map itself, little dots that are correlating. So we don't need to crank that up that high, so let's go to 0.25, see how that looks. Okay. So that looks good. We're not overkilling. We have a little bit of a push out there, so I think I'm going to resolve this with, say, a 3.2. And let's go ahead and pull back here. Let's go ahead and do a 640 by 480 render.